My, it's Christmas Day. In celebration of the occasion, let's look at a festively named station. I asked my chums over on Patreon to pick a station, and they voted for Turkey Street. So let's head up the Weaver line and see what's there. Well, I can't promise any reindeer, but I did see this muntjac, and that's basically the same thing. Turkey Street is in Bullsmoor, which is in Enfield, which is in North London. I think the first question we have to ask is, how did it get that name? I figured there were two possibilities. The one I thought most likely was that it was named after the country, perhaps in commemoration of some military action, or a visit by some Turkish dignitary, or something along those lines. But it's also not impossible that it's named after the birds. Perhaps there was a poultry market nearby, like at Smithfield. But it turns out that it's neither. It first shows up in the 15th century under the name Toki Street, which probably means street owned by someone named Toki. The name became corrupted over the years, and by the early 19th century it was Turkey Street. Probably the least interesting explanation for the name that you could get, but there it is. In any case, when the station opened in 1891, it wasn't even called Turkey Street. It was called 40 Hill. 40 Hill is about a mile from here, so I don't know what the railway company were thinking there. Well, no, I do know what they were thinking. They were thinking close enough. Turkey Street was a hamlet, 40 Hill was a village. The railways were certainly not above lying to get higher ticket sales. And who knows, maybe the company thought the railway would cause 40 Hill to expand outwards towards the station. The company in question was the Great Eastern Railway. The Great Eastern was, for its size, something of an underdog company. In the 1840s there had been a railway mania when investors got very excited about the prospect of these new railways and backed a huge number of new companies. The result was that Britain ended up with perhaps the densest railway network in the world. But not all of these railways made money. Many of the lines in East Anglia were very unprofitable. They served an area that was fairly sparsely populated with relatively little heavy freight. In 1862 they amalgamated to form the Great Eastern Railway in the hope that they could prop each other up. The directors of the Great Eastern noticed quite early on that while the farms they served didn't bring in much money, commuters did. People abandoned the slums and smoke of London for the towns and villages of Essex, Middlesex and Hertfordshire, using the railway to get to and from their jobs in the city. This was a market that simply hadn't existed during the railway mania. But the new company realised that this was a potential way to make their railway pay its way at last. The Great Eastern branched out in a literal sense, new lines being built off the main lines to serve more and more places. One of these was the Churchbury Loop. This would branch off their line to Enfield Town and run to Cheshunt. There would be 3 intermediate stations, Churchbury, 40 Hill, and Theobald's Grove. Churchbury is now Southbury. The land was pretty flat and not very developed, so construction would be cheap. It couldn't possibly fail. The railway went fairly all out with the station buildings. The hope was that they could attract wealthy people to the area who would pay for first and second class tickets. You might be wondering why I'm mentioning this, given that Turkey Street is absolutely not an all-out kind of station. Well, when it opened, it was. It was a far more substantial and indeed quite a fancy-looking station. It also had a small goods yard. So what happened to all that? Well, I'll get onto that in a bit. The first trains ran in 1891. The line was, in fact, not the massive success hoped for. Part of the problem was that it just wasn't very convenient. It was too far out, and most of the trains didn't even go all the way into London anyway. The service was poor, so no one wanted to travel out here, so suburban development did not happen. Ironically, the line made more off agricultural produce than it did off passengers. There were also brickworks served by the line, which, given the lack of houses being built, is probably also ironic. The death knell for the service was sounded on the bell of a tram. Metropolitan Electric Tramways came to the area in 1907. From a passenger perspective, the only thing the Churchbury line was good for was local journeys, and the trams were better at that. 40 Hill was particularly badly hit. The trams running right along the street highlighted how inconvenient the train service was. In other words, Turkey Street was a complete turkey. Trams were a problem for local railways all over London. Some fought back by electrifying their own lines. The Great Eastern Railway couldn't afford to do that. So in this case, they threw in the towel. Despite local protest, passenger services over the Churchbury Loop ended in 1909. Freight traffic continued. Forty Hill Station was turned into a house. According to Alan Jackson's book, London's Local Railways, its main claim to fame was being the subject of a lot of those "the family who lives in a station" slow newsday stories. In 1915, the line reopened to passengers for a very specific reason. Enfield was the home of the Royal Small Arms Factory. If you've ever heard of the Lee Enfield rifle, that's where it gets its name. Also the Royal Enfield motorbike, because for some reason small arms manufacturers liked building motorbikes, but that's another story. As you might expect, the First World War caused a massive uptick of activity at Enfield, and so passenger trains were briefly restored for the duration. In 1919, though, they were withdrawn again. Post-war, suburban development finally came to the Churchbury Loop. In 1923, the Great Eastern Railway was amalgamated into the London and North Eastern Railway. Locals petitioned the LNER to restore the Churchbury Loop service, but the company had no interest in this. Despite running some very glamorous express trains, the LNER had very little money to spare, largely because they'd taken over companies like the Great Eastern Railway. Basically, there was a practical problem here. The suburban passenger services all converged on the lines into Liverpool Street. There was no additional capacity there. The LNER's only options were 1. To sacrifice some of their only profitable trains to make way for a service that historically had not been profitable, or 2. To make their trains faster. That could only really be done by electrifying their lines, which they could not afford. In 1948, the LNER, along with most of the other railways in the country, was nationalised. British Railways, as the new railway authority was known, announced a programme of modernisation in 1954. And that meant that at long last, after decades of putting it off, the suburban lines would be electrified. And at last it was possible to reopen the Churchbury Loop to passengers. Something that had been realised during the period of closure was that the loop was a useful diversionary route when there was trouble on other lines. It seemed to BR that the loop had unrealised potential. Refurbishment began. Catenary was installed. Bridges were strengthened. Churchbury and Forty Hill were renamed to Southbury and Turkey Street. The substantially built stations were kept as they were. They were in surprisingly good condition, so they were simply refurbished. The reinstated service began on the 21st of November 1960. Service frequency was 2 trains an hour in each direction, which is also the service it has now. The 1960s saw the winding down of much of BR's freight service, so the goods yard at Turkey Street went in 1966. The service was more popular than it had been, but passenger numbers were still hardly enormous. This was perhaps why BR felt justified in knocking the station buildings here down in the 80s. Once they'd finished carving Turkey Street up, they replaced it with rather boring brick shelters. In 2015, the line was taken over by London Overground, which had had a lot of success in revitalising underused lines in the London area. Turkey Street was rebuilt again a couple of years later. Last month, as part of a programme of giving the Overground lines official names, the line through here was named the Weaver Line. These days, Turkey Street is pretty well used. It has good bus connections and there's plenty of space for car parking, which is pretty good going, given that its original builders gave it the bird. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and perhaps consider subscribing for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the electrification to my slow train. I'd also like to wish you all a Merry Christmas if you celebrate, and a Happy Holiday if you don't. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio, and compliments of the season.